Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Yousif. I'm a program officer at VentureWell. And thank you for joining us for the Advancing Equity Community Conversations on dynamic strategies for authentic outreach and faculty mentors. So we're joined by my colleague, Kristen Golden, who's a Senior Development Officer at VentureWell, as well as Dr. Damon Tull and Dr. Isabelle Monlouis. And we're going to dive into their background a little bit more, but we're going to start off with a little presentation just to set the frame and give everybody context on some of the work that VentureWell has been doing, and then discuss other leaders in the space and how they're conducting authentic outreach and engaging faculty mentors to broaden participation for students generally and faculty generally underrepresented in STEM INE. And for those of y'all just joining us, appreciate y'all for coming on. All right, let's go ahead and share the screen. Great. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the Advancing Equity Community Conversation. It's a part of a 4-part series in which VentureWell is leading a dynamic group community of practice in which we want to engage a variety of different leaders in INE STEM that are trying to advance equity across racial lines, gender lines, socioeconomic backgrounds, to ensure that we have equitable access to leveraging the resources around STEM and INE and really building careers in that path. So this specific conversation is focused on authentic outreach and engaging faculty mentors. To give everyone a brief overview of VentureWell's organization, we're a nonprofit organization that's committed to cultivating innovators in science and technology to drive and solve systemic global challenges and create lasting impact. We've been around for about 25 years, and we conduct a variety of different programs, both domestically within the US and abroad, to help early stage innovators translate their technologies, go to market, and scale. Specifically, this advancing equity work is a part of VentureWell's broader organizational commitment to increase equity and inclusion in STEM and INE. In addition to these community conversations, we have conducted a variety of different programs to evaluate some of our existing programs and exploring how can we embed equity and taking a lot of the learnings that you'll see from the report that my colleague Kristen would touch on, as well as this conversation, to improve our own internal processes, as well as the way we engage with the community. We also have a variety of different programs with faculty grantees that are also focused on trying to increase equity within the higher ed space. And from a global perspective, we also try to, where we can, implement some of these learnings into our programs. As I mentioned earlier, VentureWell, as a part of this work, has drafted the Advancing Equity Report, which my colleague Kristen Golden is actually co-author of. And I'll hand it over to Kristen actually so she can share a little bit more about the report and the background and dive into a few of the other action areas that we'll be discussing in the future.
Thanks, Amar. So yeah, we're very excited. We recently commissioned a national study to identify promising practices and existing efforts for advancing equity, specifically in the field of higher education, innovation, and entrepreneurship, although we drew more broadly from other sectors. And the desire to have this study came from the fact that the current composition of students in STEM is just not representative of the diversity in our society. And that's due to a lot of structures and systems that continue to create roadblocks that consistently constrain innovation for some groups of people, while simultaneously it clears pathways for others, for majority groups. So also, while entrepreneurship programs and centers, we understand, are really eager for strategies and solutions to increase equity and inclusion, few are tested or proven, and proactive sharing between institutions is limited. However, we do know that there are some organizations and institutions that have been addressing these issues for years, and we wanted to learn. So first we wanted to really understand who was already in the space and what was already working. So we commissioned the study, and then my colleague Shaheen Mamawala and I co-authored this report that distilled those study findings so we could share more broadly with our community. So who are we focusing on? At VentureWell, we're choosing to amplify the voices and access the innovators from groups that are listed here. So in the collective, both in the report and in this discussion today and the presentation, you'll see today, we've referenced them as underrepresented groups. And right now that's our proxy to really best describe who we're engaging with and aiming to serve, but we're very open to and seek feedback around language. We know that's really fluid, and we want to use what's resonant with our audience. So we published this report, and it's called Advancing Equity, Dynamic Strategies for Authentic Engagement in Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And the study was conducted by the firm Quality Evaluation Designs, also known as QED. In terms of their methodology, QED did both an environmental scan and then also interviewed more than 65 student early stage innovators, and the majority of whom were members of underrepresented groups, and specifically in innovation and entrepreneurship. And they also talked to 15 program directors from higher education and 9 leaders from national nonprofit organizations like Black Girls Who Code. Student voices in this study were really critical and centered, and they provided key insights into lived experiences. They gave us very honest perspectives on implicit bias and recommendations for the strategies that really work, particularly for authentic inclusion. So their words and ideas and stories are reflected throughout the report, throughout all the 6 action areas, which have their voices and some strategies that anyone can implement moving forward. So they've, sort of in total, this has created a working blueprint for programs. And this works for folks, whether you're at the beginning or if you're expanding or scaling your equity efforts. So let me just do a very high level description of the 6 action areas. And then we'll dive more deeply into areas 1 and 4, the topics for today's discussion. So action area 1 is conducting authentic outreach, which Samra will frame for you as we begin the discussion. Action area 2 is creating of inclusive spaces. And this means both creating safety as well as a really inviting place that students from underrepresented groups want to be. Action area 3 is about building confidence, especially for students who are in the earliest stages of exploring an innovation pathway. There's a tendency to feel uncertainty, perhaps to feel like an imposter. We heard quite a bit about the imposter syndrome, or that everyone else may have it all figured out. So that's something to consider. Action area 4 is on engaging mentors, and again, will be discussed in a few minutes. Action area 5 is about validating multiple pathways to success. So this includes acknowledging and validating the varying motivations that drive innovators and entrepreneurs, and the varying measures that individuals use to define their goals and success. Finally, action area 6, this is grounded in holistic organizational opportunities to advance equity by embedding equity strategies and policies and commitments throughout the organization. And this can be done in both word and deed. So that's an overview of the action areas. They're all in the report. And so now I will turn this back to Samra to dive into today's topics.
Thank you, Kristen.
Sure.
So as Kristen mentioned, we'll be talking about 2 specific action areas today. So conducting authentic outreach, and our 2 panelists will dive into a little bit deeper. But as a framing, the idea is people don't come unless you're actually speaking to them and speaking to them in the language they understand, and they understand that this is not a tokenization. Rather, this is a authentic invitation for them to come to a conversation that they're really actually adding value to. So we really want to emphasize the need for intentional relationship building outreach, right? These aren't one-offs where you send a few invitations and hope something happens, but it's about really getting into the community and going to them where they are. And I'm really looking forward to how the panelists discuss the different strategies. Again, typically there's a lot more that connects us than divides us. So really identifying where are those mutual interests, understanding how they are seen by those communities that you're trying to target, and ensuring that you're positioning yourself, your programs, your outreach in a way that is welcoming to that community. And finally, representation matters. You can't overstate the value of having people that look like you, have come from similar backgrounds, who have potentially faced some of the similar challenges as you, seeing those that have overcome some of those challenges to help you really feel like that, one, this is a career path that you can follow, but this is a community that you can join and really be valued in. And the second action area that we'll be focused on is engaging more faculty as mentors. And obviously this is the importance of faculty mentors has really expanded during this COVID era, in which, the typical opportunities for students to engage with other mentors, with other fellow students, build community, advise each other, that's limited. And so faculty members can be some of the more well-positioned individuals to help support those innovators and their fellow faculty members. But obviously, that being a mentor doesn't just come naturally. There is some support and that is required. And I know Dr. Isabelle, as well as Dr. Damon, will also discuss about the different ways to support mentors as faculty members as mentors, excuse me. And mentorship really takes different forms, right? It can be direct kind of sponsorship in which you're really taking an individual under your wing and opening up opportunities and really promoting them into those opportunities. There's ways of just connecting with people and relating and helping them understand that, they're helping them understand their ambitions and how they can translate into different opportunities. It's really important for faculty mentors to really highlight and celebrate the different identities that student innovators bring to the table, and show them that this isn't necessarily a distractor. This is something that actually creates your uniqueness. This enables you to be to bring much more to the table. And finally, this is a mutually beneficial relationship. The goal is for mentorship to be a situation in which everyone feels that they're gaining from it, both personally, professionally, and psychologically. So for today's conversation, as I mentioned, we're going to be conducting a poll actually very soon, which is going to be to really figure out who is in the room. We want to identify who's going to be a part of this conversation, and we really want to tailor this discussion toward you. And for that purpose, we're going to be discussing best practices and strategies for engaging and recruiting faculty and students of color in an authentic manner, as well as what the role of faculty members is as far as being mentors, and how can we support those faculty mentors in being more successful. So as I mentioned earlier, the poll, which may be live now, please go ahead and complete it as soon as you can. We'll have about 30 seconds or so, and that'll really give us context on who's in the room so we can make this conversation as relevant as possible. You'll also see that you have access to a chat space. The chat space is really used for introductions, continuing the conversation, maybe points that were made by the panelists you want to expand on, sharing resources. That's the place where the chat space is useful. And then the Q&A specifically is for asking questions to the panelists. So my colleague Kristen, as well as my colleague Camilo, who's the tech genius behind managing everything here, will be in both the chat space and the Q&A, responding and elevating some of the questions that are asked within the Q&A to me that I can then prompt the speakers. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I'd like to introduce the two panelists with us today. And so that everybody can see us, it's not just little tiny faces on the screen. But Dr. Isabelle Monlouis, I'd like to start with you. Can you please introduce yourself?
Of course. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Isabelle Monlouis. I am the Associate Director of the Russell Center for Entrepreneurship at Georgia State University. It is a mouthful. It's also part of our Entrepreneurship and Innovation Institute. And so we are one of those groups that feels very strongly that those two disciplines are complementary and they only strengthen each other. And we try to expose our students to both disciplines until perhaps they choose a specialty. I work at the intersection of corporate innovation, leadership excellence, and inclusive entrepreneurship, which perhaps is most appropriate for today's conversation. And what that means is we take to heart to prepare our students to grow into the leaders who can create and build solutions that improve the condition, their own well-being, but also solutions that help them make a difference for themselves, from their families, and from their communities. I like to talk about it in terms of creating success on their own terms. But when we think about the population of students that we're trying to serve, it sometimes includes their own leadership skills, as well as a suite of skills that are perhaps more technical in nature, whether it's STEM or sort of the entrepreneurship skill set. And that's me.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Damon?
Good morning. I'm Damon Tull. I'm the Director of Industry Alliances for the University of California, Davis Graduate School of Management, Michael Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm a former professor of electrical engineering in the early days of the digital camera. I'm a technology entrepreneur and inventor and workforce development champion. I've worked for organizations such as NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NRO, and DARPA. And before joining UC Davis, I had multiple leadership positions at the American Society for Engineering Education, where I oversaw the portfolio of ASE's fellowships, as well as administered multiple fellowships related to industrial postdoctoral opportunities for underrepresented groups. In my current role at UC Davis, I research the ecosystem, the science and engineering and innovation entrepreneurship ecosystem. I study the capital flows in those areas and work with public and private sector sponsors to enhance opportunities for those who are not currently participating fully in those opportunities. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
I appreciate that. And so as you can see, we have a deep well of knowledge coming from a variety of different places between the two panelists. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Again, encourage everyone to, if you have questions you want for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A, and also encourage you just to engage in the chat space. So I just want to dive into it now. First question, Isabelle, it's for you. Can you share a few strategies for broadening participation in I&E through authentic outreach that you've tested or implemented at your institution? And specifically just talking about, what worked well or some challenges that you faced.
Yes, so when we think about authentic outreach, I think it's important to first focus on who we're trying to serve. And so our first pillar really is the students and what matters most to them. And I don't know that we can really design strategies for engagement or for participation unless we understand sort of the barriers that they experience along the way. And so I like to think of it in two ways. First, in thinking about what is our desired outcome, and then reverse engineering the best possible path, but being clear and being aware of all of the barriers that certainly the group that we're trying to represent, whether it's about gender or an ethnic background, or perhaps socioeconomical status, understand the barriers that would prevent them from reaching sort of that path. And even if we understand that there are multiple paths to success, some of those barriers actually transcend a single path. So the first thing that we do, and that I would invite others to consider, is we design for engagement, we design for participation, and we design for success around understanding who our students are and what they need. So one of the common denominators for our students, for example, is that they have very little time. Oftentimes we have non-traditional students, they are maybe carrying multiple jobs. They are trying to get to graduation as quickly as possible so they could have their full-time jobs and devote themselves to a career. And unless they've already declared entrepreneurship as a primary path, it's hard for them sometimes to fit this into the existing very busy curriculum. So what we do is that we actually design entrepreneurship and innovation, education, and the path to developing their ventures into their school curriculum. So even though we have pathways for students who are focused on who want to do these co-curricular activities, we actually have pathways that are degree granting pathways. So they can actually make this the focus of their education and leverage their course content and their every single class to actually move their venture forward. So that's one path, right? Another path is to understand that many of our students don't necessarily identify with being an entrepreneur. Perhaps the ones they've seen on TV, they don't look like them, they don't sound like them, maybe they don't have the same amount of resources, and they might count themselves out. So part of it is making sure that they understand that they're not only welcome, but they are actively sought after, that they have access to skills that could be really important. I talk about entrepreneurial grit. There's some things that we can teach, but there are some assets you already have. And also they oftentimes understand overlooked market. There's value in the communities they come from. There's value in the lens that they use when they see at difficulties or opportunities. And it's likely that they're not the only person or the only subgroup that actually needs a solution that would make their life easier. And in that way, they may have an edge over somebody else. But this is not the way they think about it. So we try to reframe, and we try to help them through the course of initially meeting them when they're curious, but help them understand that they might be a really good fit for an entrepreneurial path. So there's a process of identity development, if you will, and sometimes that includes the appropriate language. So they may think of themselves as creators, perhaps, or change makers before they feel that they can own with integrity the title of an entrepreneur. And so we start where they are. We help them build both the confidence and the portfolio of successes that help them, hold this very, firmly. And then there's much I could say, but I want to share also that you cannot design for engagement of just the students. You actually have to design for engagement in the entire ecosystem. And that includes, yes, the faculty and mentors, as well as some partners in the larger ecosystem. And understand that the faculty also oftentimes carries a workload with different measures of success. Again, if you integrate into a degree granting curriculum, it's easier to get the faculty engaged. But one of the things it was very insightful for us is to realize that the faculty actually wants to help, but sometimes they themselves feel a little bit out of their depth because the entrepreneurship skill set is so well-rounded that the faculty may think that they're experts at what they teach, but the full scale, the full scope of what mentorship is needed is beyond their own ability to coach a student effectively. And so one of the ways in which we address this particular challenge is by making sure that we move from a model where you have one faculty mentor to a network of mentors. And this way, your faculty mentors can actually work from their zone of genius, where they can contribute most and be most self-expressed and most effective. But as a team, we contribute what the students want. And so those are some of the ways in which we can provide sufficient amount of support throughout the entire journey. And so that the students feel that, again, ongoingly, they're receiving the education as well as the support that they need to develop into successful, independent entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much for that, Isabelle. And there's a lot of nuggets in there that I really want to start to tease out a little bit more. Specifically things around mentioning, like, it's about the value that they bring, right? Identifying that this isn't necessarily charity, right? Like you're solving pretty critical problems in communities that maybe others don't have a lens in. And regardless of how you self-identify as far as a problem solver, innovator, entrepreneur, there's a role for you in the INE ecosystem.
Absolutely, and I suspect that my colleague David has actually so much more to say on this particular topic, but I think it's really important, perhaps, this is perhaps where I should have started, is our common understanding that diversity is an asset. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I like to think of it, sometimes I refer it as really as my secret weapon, or perhaps not so secret, but as a superpower, which again, not just makes more successful teams, but again, give them a lens for which they can see in a way that identifies opportunities. And I think that for us as institutions, it's also a superpower that we can leverage. Because if we design for those who have the most constraints, not only will they be successful at scale, many of them, but this system will actually be even more supportive of all the others who perhaps have a certain set of advantages, but they rarely have them all across the board. And so I think that this strategy for inclusion of certain subgroup actually benefits everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think this is why we should really, so it's an opportunity. And it's a way for us to develop a program that works better for every single one of our students and frankly our faculty as well. So thank you for helping me tease that up.
No, thank you. Damon, I know you have also a lot of thoughts on this. So please share a little bit more about strategies and you've used on your campus and through your experience that have worked as far as authentic outreach.
Well, I can speak from personal experience as being a product of programs that actually worked very well. And when I think of the term authentic outreach, I reflect on those moments and times when individuals reached me and directed me. And then now 35 years into my career, I look back on that and I say, look at the chain of trust that had to be present for those relationships to work. So I reflect on the time I got my first internship. I received a phone call from the assistant dean, and the assistant dean simply said, "Come down to the office. We have an internship for you. We want you to take it." I said, "Okay." I showed up and signed the paper, and 2 weeks later, I was in Dallas learning about Mobil Oil Corporation. And I reflect on the chain of trust that had to be in place between the dean and myself, the dean and the organization and those who represent the organization. And so I&E programs can start by looking at themselves as a link in the chain of trust, the chain of trust of opportunity. And I look at it as, this is a relationship. There's two parties in place. When something's authenticated, there's someone who presents credentials, and there's someone who authenticates those credentials. And the authenticator are the students, as mentioned earlier, as well as the faculty advisors, the faculty mentors, the chairs, the deans, anyone that has a stake in the success of the students you're trying to reach. They are the authenticators. And the question is, what are they authenticating? And I believe there's three areas that they're authenticating. One, they're authenticating values. Do you value what the students value? Are you presenting information that will be valuable to the students? And does the program team represent the values of the students? This value composition is very important. And the second thing that's being authenticated is commitment. Commitment to create environments for learning. Learning means success and failure. That means opportunities to engage at a deep level. And that's a very important thing. But the most important thing amongst programs that are seeking to reach underrepresented groups is to create community. Community and connection is another area that has to be authenticated, or just being authenticated by the students. It's, like you said, not a one-off opportunity. This has to be not just authentic outreach, but authentic engagement, going beyond just the outreach, the first touch, the multiple touches. But now this is a continuing conversation. And the third thing that's being authenticated by the students and the faculty will be trust. Are you going to follow through on everything that you say you're going to do? And I think it boils down to the following reality, is that the systems that we have now that are in place at the end of the day are giving us the output that they're designed to give. I'm quoting Deming. I'm reminded by Dr. Carl Reed from the National Society for Black Engineers, who reminded me what Deming said about this issue. The system is giving you exactly what it's designed to give you. And if you don't like the output, you have to look at the system. And I'll take one step further. There are 5 areas that you want to consider if you want to change the way your system is working. First, the people. Second, the policies, the procedures, the resources, and the context in which the system resides is giving you the output that you have. And so we're dealing with the systems themselves. So this authentic outreach has to be proactive. It cannot be passive. So the way you reach underrepresented groups is through that process of being actively engaged in reaching them. And I tell people all the time, it's a contact sport. I ran a program for the National Science Foundation that started out with 35% women and minority participation, and in 2 years grew it to 65% women and minority participation. And of course, the naysayers were like, you're not going to find the talent. The talent is out there. It's just, it can be reached through authentic outreach, and I'd say authentic engagement, and through building those relationships. And so echoing everything that Isabelle said, that these are strategies that to be taken. One of the strategies that I would encourage every I&E program on campus, or those who are outside, is to engage their DEI office on campus. And this is interesting, because what's happening here at UC Davis is very important. We have a very strong DEI office that also has now laid out a scholarly approach to transformative justice here on campus to enhance the communities on the campus. It's a wide-ranging strategic plan that's being implemented by scholars here on our campus. And I'm sure every institution that's represented here today may have a DEI office, or even a department level or college level office that is working towards creating change in the systems. This is an opportunity to connect there. And one of the first things you can do, and this is something that was first promoted, there's a book coming out from Dr. Lawrence and Maisha Wynn. They're promoting transformative justice, and they have a book that talks about the 5 pedagogical stances for TJE. And one of the stances I'll share today is language. So every I&E organization can start internally with the language that they use to refer to the students they want to reach. And that's a beautiful place to start, because now you start to realize that this is an engagement of let's say, minoritized individuals or marginalized individuals. And suddenly it becomes real that there's an opportunity to engage. And it changes the nature of the engagement when we start to put the right understanding behind the approach to the engagement in general. But thank you very much for that. Those are my comments on that particular point, but there's many other strategies we can talk about as we get to the next section.
No, I appreciate that, and I'm grateful that this is recorded so that I can go back and pull out some of those key points that both of y'all have dropped. I want to go back to a point you mentioned earlier on linking the chain of trust of opportunity. And I think that really ties into the idea of faculty mentors and building that trust and being a part of the continuous support that students can have to get, grow as students, individuals, and innovators. Can you talk a little bit about from a strategy of engaging faculty mentors and preparing them to be a solid link in the chain of trust, as you mentioned, to provide those students with the resources, mentorship, be a sounding board that they need?
I think the easiest way to do this is to find ways to integrate with their current activities. As we've heard earlier, that there's a significant load on faculty, especially during this time. This is, in fact, the teaching load now feels heavier because now everything's online. But even before then, I would say that if you're an INE program and you're seeking to engage faculty mentors, or you recognize that you want to do this, I think at a point where you're not engaging junior faculty, their job is to get tenure, teaching, research, grantsmanship, and publications. Their scholarly work is their focus until they receive tenure. However, keep them in the loop. But the senior faculty are the ones that may have a bit more margin or opportunity to be, let's say, directly involved. And as mentioned, and I guess as a former faculty member in engineering, I can say that I recognize that my skill set is engineering, and so the scope of what is being requested in the context is the reality that I know technology, I know engineering, I know how to build the best widget, but now the business side is where that's a little bit more challenging. So in terms of faculty mentoring, I think that's what do you expect from the faculty? That has to be well defined in this context. So, but in terms of faculty, I think it's important that faculty recognize that it's an opportunity to identify talent and to direct that. There's a large push in areas of improving faculty mentoring through the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Angela Byers Winston and her team at the end. I think it's the National Mentoring Network, doing a lot of work on enhancing mentoring in the biomedical sciences. There's a lot of resources out there that can be used to help faculty be better mentors. But in terms of engaging faculty mentors and INE programs, I believe it's got to be something that's of interest to the faculty member and also easily integrated into their current work, whether it's undergraduate research or graduate research. I think that's one way to start.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it also dovetails really well into something Isabelle said when we last connected about overburdening faculty members, and how specifically faculty members of color can start to share a much larger burden of, not necessarily burden, but weight of supporting a lot of students of color that kind of naturally aggregate toward them because they see themselves in them. Isabelle, so this is a bit of a twofold question. So the first part is really around, your experience recruiting and engaging faculty members as students and innovators, but then also drilling into it a little bit more on how do you distribute that like support to students, not only from faculty of color, but also faculty that aren't of color. And speaking specifically, as I looked at the poll findings a little bit earlier, we have a decent diversity within this call, although it leans a little bit more toward our white colleagues. So also speaking to them, how would you advise them on being strong faculty mentors?
So thank you. I think the first part to acknowledge is that engagement of mentors, especially faculty mentors, is a key ingredient in the student success. So it's not just something that we'd like to have, it's something that is necessary to have a successful program. And one of the ways in which we engage faculty members as mentors, I think, it goes back to what Damon was saying about trust. Part of how you engender that trust is you lead by example. So the ability to say that you yourself, either if you're a faculty member, and I'm also on the faculty team, but that you actually are able to, that you find ways to both teach and mentor students, and that you can show that it is actually possible, I think is in itself one of the ways in which you become credible as somebody who's making that request of other faculty members. So that's one of the places where I start. In addition to that, again, understanding the level of support and the ongoing support that students need in order to be successful, I think, back to what Damon said, we need to design for it. We need to design systems that allow faculty to be successful given their roles and given the amount of time that they can devote to mentorship. So whether they are rewarded for it is also important, but it's also making sure that they can be effective, as I mentioned, within either their zone of genius, their scope of expertise, and or their scope of interest. So if you think about it, oftentimes the student-faculty relationship will be constrained to a semester, right? Perhaps two, unless it's their advisor, in which case it might be longer. But obviously it takes a lot longer than a semester to help a student develop an innovation and a venture. And so the mentorship relationship oftentimes will outlast a traditional student-faculty relationship. And again, this is where literally designing a system that supports this engagement is important. So what's interesting is that if you just look at people who actually raise their hand and say, I would like to do this, you have enough oftentimes to get started and to show proof of concept and to create sort of your first successes. Where it becomes even more important to design the system to support this kind of engagement at scale is when you were trying to scale your program up, in which case it's important to not just map the path, but also begin to develop some structures to help develop the faculty into the mentors that they want to be. They probably are not expert in mentorship itself. So sometimes it's providing those resources and helping them be successful as part of a team. So COVID and going online has actually been both a blessing and a bit of a challenge. So it's a blessing because we now have access to a much larger group of experts, or which could be current faculty or former faculty mentors. And I see somebody just mentioned alumni mentors in the chat, and that's true. We also have we're able to integrate in sort of this mentoring network a larger number of people who are no longer constrained by geography. And so this abundance has been a blessing for the coaching of students, the mentoring of students. On the other hand, there are relationships that were sparked by the intentional collision that we create in the spaces that we design for people to meet that are no longer happening in the same way. So what that means is that in order to create this very deep network of relationships, so a dense tissue, we need to be very intentional about creating those connections. And again, so that goes back to design, creating those connections, creating agreements, providing support, especially when in this particular environment with COVID, people feel that they're pulled in so many directions and their load is harder. So facilitating the process becomes that much more important. And I think this is what we're learning in COVID. And here's the good news, is that those structures will transfer back. And again, I believe that they will help us be more effective when we go back to a more sort of traditional way of interacting with each other.
That was really good, thank you. And I think the point of alumni mentors really does plug into this well. Just speaking of like on a personal story, I didn't get into entrepreneurship as an undergrad because I thought I was an entrepreneur. It was because of my one semester as an engineering student before I switched to economics. I had a Black engineering professor that told me the way I was approaching and talking to him about a lot of problems was very innovative. And he encouraged me to start going to this entrepreneurship club where I got exposed to a lot more of what entrepreneurship is. And that's eventually what led me into the path of entrepreneurship, becoming really committed to it. After becoming really involved in that community and becoming the president of the Entrepreneur Society, when I graduated, I'm still talking to people back on my campus, and I'm still trying to point them in the right direction for resources. And to the point, it's a feedback loop, right? And you provide that support at the top that then trickles down and then has exponential impact in the community. So I love how you phrase that. So I'd like to get a little bit also just more like tactical, because I'm sure that people are curious about, say, from like an authentic outreach perspective, what worked in the past, and also what didn't, and specifically around things that can be taken out to be attributed to a COVID world, right? Where you're not meeting students in the, I don't know, I've been too far out of college, I forget what the student union's called, but yeah, just talking a little bit more about your experiences and how you think that can translate to COVID. Now, Damon, we can start with you.
Well, COVID's complicated a lot of this situation. But what's interesting that we're seeing here at UC Davis is that faculty are still doing seminars, still engaging in seminar presentations. This is an opportunity for both students as well as faculty to reach out to students when they have these talks. For example, I know our Smart Farm initiative has had a number of different talks. I've reached out to students across the country who are in ag to attend these talks here at UC Davis. This is an opportunity to virtually connect people who would never normally meet each other, but through the opportunity of using Zoom and other opportunities like that, we can engage the faculty. But faculty this has to be intentional, and now more than ever. And this is a challenge I think I don't see a solution for in the near future. Almost everyone on this call is really leveraging their relationships that they had before COVID. And benefiting from that young person who is just starting out, we now, as those who have connections, need to be more proactive in this way, meaning that when there is a presentation, being engaged in chat, being able to reach out and be willing to link up with some of the students on LinkedIn and have meaningful conversations to make the connections, because otherwise there's no other way to have that opportunity. Now, other than that, we do have at the UC Davis and the Institute in particular, we have what is called UC Mentors. It's a platform of over 700 alumni and alumni mentors who mentor the students and faculty who go through our programs. And we have a number of different, one of our flagship training programs is called the Entrepreneurship Academy. And also we have a national, actually now it's regional business plan and education program called the Big Bang and the Little Bang. And these programs, as participants, now you have opportunity to engage on a platform of more than 700 mentors, alumni, and then others are just simply entrepreneurs and angel investors in the region who want to see more activity in innovation and entrepreneurship at UC Davis and at UC in general. So I think this is an opportunity to do that by setting up platforms. The way that platform works is, in particular, if you go through our program, you receive tokens. And those tokens allow you to select individuals in the database to arrange meetings. And when you have that meeting, you have a token. You spend that token to have a conversation. I don't know how long they are, maybe 30 minutes, but there's an opportunity to engage that mentor. And you can do that through that system. When you're out of tokens, you can either ask for more or find other ways to engage. But it's an opportunity for students to engage on a platform. So I think one strategy is to start to look at developing platforms where mentors are made available through office hours or otherwise, so that students can find mentors in each other. And I think that's one way to do it. Everyone's pre-screened and everyone has a similar interest. So I think it's an interesting platform. It's been very successful so far for us.
I really love this idea of the platform. And we had a very similar idea and we did not implement it quite as successfully. So since you asked about what didn't work. So what we found is that our students were not necessarily prepared to make the best use of the resources of the mentors that we had available. And again, who oftentimes were experts in a particular field. So so I think that where we are right now is investing a little bit. So first of all, we're making some very intentional introductions for the teams that we are supporting. So they can actually continue to move forward. But while we're doing this, in order to help the students get the most out of these kinds of platforms, what we're trying to do is making sure that the students themselves grow into a capacity to make better use of mentors. So again, what this is morphing into is a system where the student team may have a primary mentor. And then eventually this relationship morphs in such a way that they understand how to be the best mentee possible, how to interact with somebody from a standpoint of either strategy or very specific technical need. And they become more in charge. And if you will, you sort of co-create with your primary mentor what this relationship will look like over time. And they begin to build up their capacity to use mentorship effectively. So not just to know how to reach out and to be effective, but also how to leverage the information that's being provided to them in a way that they can continue to integrate this information into the venture. And I really loved when Damon started and I shared sort of a personal example. I'm thinking of a team that I'm working with. And when they first began, they have a great idea, it's patented, everybody loves what they're doing. potentially really great market. And when they began, and they would get some interest from other spaces, and they would get so excited about any single offer that came in. And I talked to them again last week, and it's amazing to see sort of how much they've grown over the course of a year or two, and sort of how they're thinking differently about the people coming to the table and their ability to evaluate what might be a good fit, what might not be a good fit, and why, who they need to reach out to. And what I love is that from what we started, which was sort of giving them a path and coaching them in a very sort of active way, they've become co-creators of the relationship, and they reach out and they make requests. And I think that this is part of what we want. And they're at the stage where, of course, you could let them loose on any platform and they will identify the resources to make the best out of them. But understanding again that sometimes you start from where they are. Not every team starts at a stage where they actually are able to best navigate. And which that means is that the mentors don't always feel that it's a good use of their expertise or their time. And so the benefit of this strategy is that eventually everybody gets really excited, and the mentors are just so, feel so validated and so good about sort of what they've been able to contribute in this 30-minute increment that they can't wait to do it more. And so it actually helps fit into the sustainability of the system, because they can see how they're adding value. And I think that this is part of what we want to get to, the part where everybody is more engaged. As the more they participate, the more engaged they become, because they realize that they're adding value, and then they, again, help contribute to how to make the system better.
That's a really good point. And I want to tease out a little bit a point that both of y'all made on being a good mentor and being a good mentee. And I think it would be helpful for us to hear from your perspective, what is a good mentor? What are the qualities, actions that an individual should take to be a good mentor? And conversely, what should students be doing to also be well positioned to take advantage of that support?
Damon, you want to start? I know that you are very passionate about this.
Well, it's one of I've personally experienced great mentorship in various parts of my career, and it's someone that really just took an interest in seeing me develop and get to another place. And I think that's one of the characteristics of a good mentor. In fact, being a good mentor also requires that you be somehow an expert in the field. That helps a lot. That helps to help the person navigate the technical aspect of that. Also, someone who really has the best interest of the person that they want to mentor at heart. And then thirdly, there's got to be something about that mentor that's admirable, something, that quality that the mentee wants to acquire, that, or be, to identify with that characteristic, whether it's, it's funny, I tell a story. I was ready, and this is something that my advisor may or may not know. My advisor never talked to me when I was in my thesis. He talked to me on a rare occasion. We met every week or so, but it was just about the paper. And then we published something one time, and I was about to leave until I was like, why am I associated with this mentor? And when we went to a conference together, he took me to a conference, and it was there that I saw who he was. He was a rock star. We couldn't go 15 feet without a mob. And I realized, wow, okay, so he's different in different places, but he cares about what I'm doing. So what he's doing, he's training me to be like him. And that was an interesting reality, and we've become friends. In fact, we started our first company together later on down the road. So I would advise mentees not to take the first impression as the only impression of your mentor. They're under a lot of different pressure at the time he was going through tenure. Have a little patience with some of your mentors out there. But I think it's important that as a mentee, you also have to be somehow proactive in that relationship. Every summer job I got at AT&T Biolaboratory was just because I went during lunchtime to different offices and asked, what did the researchers do? And that's one of the easiest questions to ask a professor or a researcher, because they'd be glad to tell you what they do. And if you show interest in that, you'll be surprised how the relationship grows and how the conversation grows. And so it's that sandbox that you can play in. It's that science and engineering technology sandbox. And once you start to play in that and engage in that, you'll be surprised that mentors will emerge almost organically, because you've taken an interest in what they do. And I found that to be a very successful strategy for me, just taking interest in what people do, especially at the university in the research areas that you might be interested in.
Thank you. Yes, so everything that Damon said, so then I'm going to extend the answer and say twofold. I remember earlier you asked me about shared the composition of the people on the call, and you asked me about, well, how can they participate? And I think a point that we made is that a mentor does not have to look exactly like you in order to be a great mentor. So I think that, Damon, I remember you used the language of, not on this call, but earlier, the language of coalition of the willing. And I thought that was so appropriate, because the most important part about a mentor is that they're willing. You cannot force somebody to be a mentor. And so their willingness is first. And again, so whoever's willing will actually, is more likely to listen from a place of contribution, and that's really important. Another characteristic I would echo what Damon said, which is also this developmental lens. So, people are still arguing about whether entrepreneurship or anything else is about nature or nurture. I think it's irrelevant in that no matter where you come from, there's still an opportunity to continue to develop in your skill set. And exposure is important, and learning more about what your mentor does, but developing this capacity, the curiosity and the skill set to continue to grow, to continue to learn, to continue to expand into the person who can do the work that needs to be done, who can lead a venture, who can bring a product to market. It's a process, and part of what a mentor does is nurture that relationship while the student or the mentee is actually growing. So that means twofold, is that they have to be willing to see you where you are, but also having that space to understand what you can be. But a mentor also has to be willing to be flexible about what that is, because perhaps what they see, this is not the path the student is going to take. And so there's a level of understanding that they may choose their own path. And so again, so the problem is sometimes we want to give them everything we have and make them just like us. And just like you don't have to look like us when we start, they may not look like us when they finish, right? They may choose a different path, and that's okay too. And so that's important. And from the student's perspective, what makes a great mentee, then absolutely, they have to be proactive. But they also have to understand that it's a two-way relationship, and they have to be willing to invest into the relationship. And what that means is, again, perhaps you're proactive, perhaps you come prepared. Perhaps you don't expect that every answer will be provided the first time, and perhaps you build into the relationship before you make a request. And it may also look like being coachable. You don't have to take everything that your mentor says at face value, but perhaps it's helpful to listen and to explore in which way it might be helpful. And then it's helpful to take action. So even a very enthusiastic mentor may actually run out of enthusiasm if they feel like they're trying to engage and help a student sort of grow, and nothing is happening on the other side, and they're not getting any feedback. There's no interaction, there's no action taken, or anything that they say is rejected. And so I think that is sort of that balance. I think of it a little bit as a dance that actually evolves over time. And I think that makes some of the most amazing mentorship, to the point that sometimes they continue long after the student graduates, and the relationship evolves. So I think part of it is also allowing each other to evolve and to grow inside a mentoring relationship.
I love that. And I think that's so important, right? It's a lifelong relationship that continues to form and morph. And who knows, one day the roles may switch, but the idea is, because you're so invested in each other and recognize the value that both of you bring to the table, that, it's meaningful, everybody involved. So we have a final question that actually came in from Cindy Cooper from the Lemelson Foundation. And we only have a few more minutes left in the webinar. So just please keep the response a little bit prompt, but you both mentioned the importance of authentic engagement. So on your campuses, are you training mentors to develop their capacity and effective engagement with students from those underrepresented groups? And if you are, just a few highlights on what that looks like. And I know that's not a question that can be answered very briefly, but this is a test for you.
I can say at UC Davis that there's a suite of resources, in fact, an entire curriculum for racial justice and everything related to how to become a better ally and how to engage underrepresented groups with opportunities. That's a curriculum that has been recently published by the UC Davis, very broad curriculum as well. I can share that in a link. But what we're finding is that those who are among the coalition of the willing, as we talked about in our gathering, that coalition of the willing is reaching out and engaging in that curriculum. They are training themselves. They're seeking to understand how to make that connection. And I think that's very excited about that. It's a very exciting thing that's happening on UC Davis's campus. I know it's happening in our institute. A number of our staff members are really engaging and understanding underrepresented populations and the challenges and how to engage the groups on campus more authentically. It's working well here.
Wonderful. So what I can say is that when in many campuses, they have to seek out those underrepresented students, those that many would consider underrepresented students are pretty much the majority of the 55,000 students that we have at Georgia State University. So, so it is a focus of how we engage every student, if you will. And I can say that we, certainly at the Institute, we recruit with that lens in mind, but this is literally one of the first question, the first lenses that we look at. But as we expand the number of people that we engage in within the larger ecosystem or elsewhere in the university, it's important to make sure that that becomes part of the way everyone engages our student and part of our brand. And so with that understanding, we're as everybody else, we're doing equity audits of our own practices and then all of the spaces in which our students evolve. And we are putting in place the appropriate level of training. So that was one of our insights, is that we had to be more systematic, and we had to make this kind of resources and training available to all of the stakeholders and all of those who engage with our students on that pathway to development. So I guess I will be calling Damon and getting some resources to see in terms of best practices, because if they've got something that works really well, then we're more than happy, like we're doing today, to share some best practices and to accelerate our path there.
I think both of you are actually getting a few calls from us and some of the participants as well, because this has been an amazing discussion. I like one point you said, evaluating the spaces in which your students evolve. And that's also something that we've also been discussing, and it's an action area in the report on creating those inclusive spaces where those students can thrive. So that's definitely something that we're also considering and thinking about deeply. So as we start to wrap up, do y'all have just a few final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience? Isabelle, we start with you.
Very simply, I think this is where we started, which is designing with centering the students in the way we design. And fortunately, if they were shy before they start the process, the more they develop their entrepreneurial skills, the more outspoken they are. And therefore, if you listen, they will let you know the places where you're doing really well and the places where you could improve. Mm-hmm. So my invitation is to listen and to begin to create the kind of dialogue that they not only tell you candidly what needs to change or what needs to remain the same, but where we also engage them as co-creators of the solutions and of the spaces and of where we focus. I think that as universities, sometimes we focus on what we have to teach, and we forget again that process you just spoke about, which can go the other way, and that sometimes our students have just as much to teach us on how to serve them best. And so that's my final invitation, is to co-create.
Oh, nothing to add there. Isabelle, you really hit every nail on the head there. That's exactly right. It has to be a collaborative effort, and it's a co-creation effort, and we will learn from the students what is needed and necessary, and that's the feedback. And I think the INE program should also look at the idea of being frank about, the gathering the appropriate statistics and measurement. We talked about measurement in our pre-brief, and that's so important in the context here to really understand, because you can only manage what you can measure. Yes. And that's the context where we're at now. So as the groups become more comfortable measuring participation, reporting out and discussing that participation level of different groups in the programs, and they start to see where they can make changes and adjustments, this is the opportunity to reach out to the campus Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, the National Society of Black Engineers, the ACES chapters. These are places where you engage and start the conversation, and that means being present, sponsoring events. That means bringing in guest lecturers for those groups as a result of that relationship. And I think you'll start to see that engagement grow, and you'll start to get even more students engaging in the programs. But it's going to be very important in the near future that we look at this, because it's in fact an important issue for our country. Economically, we cannot continue in the direction of low participation or under participation in high-tech entrepreneurship going forward. It's a national need that we broaden participation in these areas, and the data is starting to show that.
Thank you both for that. I think I speak on behalf of the coalition of the willing that are on the call right now. That really appreciate all the insights that you've shared, and there were a lot of resources that both of y'all touched on that I think we'd love to follow up with y'all and share them with the broader community, because I think it's really invaluable. Before we get everybody off back to the rest of your days, just quickly want to go over what the conversation looks like moving forward. So as we mentioned, that this community conversation is a part of a sequence of engagements. So we will be publishing another article focused on creating inclusive spaces and building confidence, as well as having another webinar with two or three other speakers to speak on it. Also encourage everyone here to save the date for Open 2021. It'll be virtual, March 17th to 19th. Where we're going to continue these conversations around equity. Conference submission ideas are on November 20th. As a reminder, there will be a survey that pops up right as you close it. It'll only take you about 1:45 seconds. We timed it. So really appreciate your feedback, so that we can make sure that these conversations, the community of practice that we're forming, really meets the needs and of the community. So if you have any questions, ideas, thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to equity@venturewell.org. I really appreciate everybody for joining us. Damon, Isabelle, thank you all for your time and sharing your thoughts.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.